Okay, so that was void null. So what this video is about, I think for the dojo guys, is to think about how to do templates. I know this is a cyberpunk challenge, a cyberpunk template challenge actually. So the idea here is to come up with a template that helps you design songs. So I'll be working through I'll show you what this template's about, what I've done, and maybe give you some tips in terms of how you can make your own cyberpunk tracks. Now, in general, I use a synthesizer called Faceplant. I've got the suite of plugins from Kilohertz. I'm not going to get too much into specifics on that in terms of other than how I use it in terms of the template, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the only thing you can do. I just like it. So for example, I've still got things like Serum as well. Whoops. Okay. So I've got Serum, but I don't use it on this template at the moment. And I've also got Vital. So I've got all sorts of different things. So I'll just explain a bit. So I'm using Cubase, although you can use Live. Most of the principles are the same. It just depends on your choice of DAW, on what you want to do. But I'll just explain how I've done it in Cubase and maybe give you some hints in terms of what happens in Ableton Live. So the first things I've got here is the tempo and the track locators. Track locators basically means that you can jump to specific sections of a track. Now, then and the tempo is like if you want to do variable tempo, you can adjust the tempo from here. That's not necessarily the big part. The big part is using scratch pads. So you might be wondering, well, what is this? So what tends to happen when you're making a track, let's say that you're, let's just grab this. Let's just say that, for example, I had an instrument set up here. Okay. So I'm still having issues from the upgrade of my computer. So I've recently upgraded my computer and half the stuff doesn't work. Typical. So the idea behind a scratch pad, called a dump, is basically you're working with parts of a song and you don't necessarily want to commit the automation or anything else to it. So like you write your instrument track here, and it's not part of the sound. It's like it's not part of the export. It's basically a place where you can experiment and then delete without any repercussions to things, let's say down here. Now, one thing to note is that in Cubase you've got these locators, and some people what they do is that they have a separate tracks, like what I've done here for a scratch pad. Others what they do is that they'll have like the first 100 bars are going to be scratch pads, and then they'll have the locators here to help you track backwards and forwards. So it doesn't necessarily mean that's the point of it is that you can experiment in this space in this scratch pad and not necessarily worry about impacting your track. Now in Cubase you can have a chord track. This goes to piano VST, so if you want to like have your things like your chord progressions listed on top here, you can actually have that, and then it'll just play the flat chords as you go along. Now I have an instrument group. In theory, the FX group should not be part of that, but I've got like this grouping where I called it instruments because again, this is the actual live part of the setup. So scratch pad not exported, instruments is exported. and I've got the FX section. So I've got like parts of here where like I think, you know, VSTs or sound effects that don't necessarily play part of the track, but they add ambience or anything like that go in here. And they all route to this signal bus here, which allows me to control the FX throughout the track. This then goes out to another signal chain, but we'll get to that later. Now, I'll explain this a bit. So, the way that I've got my instrument layout is that I've got a subsection for Cyberpunk, so things that are like I would commonly use for Cyberpunk. Drums, I'll do the drums example first. So I've got different configurations of XO running different drum sets. Now in some cases I will have more than one drum running at a time. So like, you know, so I might have, you know, brake machine along with industrial, partly because they have different or maybe complementary sound sets. So, you know, I don't necessarily want to undo my entire drum machine setup, so I just duplicate it, change what I want, and then I leave it here in drums. Now the thing is that they both have 3 signal outs. So the main one here is the main signal out. So everything but the kick and snare. So bus 1 is the kick, bus 2 is the snare. So everything but the kick and snare go through here. Again, you don't have to do this, but that's what I've done. And that means that I can have different properties. So in this example, I used to have, because I cloned it before from some other thing, the equalizer was set to drop off at, you know, like start dropping off at 1 kilohertz for the kick. And the compressor, you know, set to 4:1 at some ridiculously high ratio. And same as the snare, like I think on this one there's a little bit more cut off at the high end, so we raise the high end frequencies to make the snare stand out a bit more in that case. But the idea here is like, again, this plugin I don't use that with those ones, so I haven't changed them yet. But this plugin then routes the kick and snare to the different buses, and they go here, and then they get bounced to a separate bus down the bottom. So they get routed to here. So we have kick and snare. So because I have more than one drum kit, I don't just mix them all up here. I tend to send them down here separately, and then depending on the situation and how the kick and snare interact, I might do further processing here. I can't exactly explain what I did here, but I use multipass here to boost the warmness of the kick and snare. I then distort it below 169 Hertz. Then I phase shift it. So it changes phase shift around 149 Hertz. Between that and any higher than 1.04 kilohertz, I gently distort it again, and then I add a small reverb amount, just so that it sounds like it's a gated reverb. So that's what it does. So drums common is basically where, like I said before, XO has this one, this group. So this is like hi-hats or anything else that goes in through the mix, but I don't necessarily want to compress sidechain them, so they just go here. Special is basically things like the taiko drums, so I send them into the special section. And special might have its own separate processing again. Why don't I do it up there? Partly because, like, if I have more than one, I can just, you know, more than one special, I might just adjust it here rather than up. So it just depends on how you want to, like, maybe you want to do everything here, or maybe you don't want to do everything here, and how many other signals get mixed into this block versus how much is there here. So then we get to common. Again, not much here, it's just an aggregation point. And then we finally hit the drums, which is the last step before we send it out to the master or audio out. You can see here, like we've got the audio spectrograph of the and you can see so this is just a way of analyzing how your drums look, where they sit. But in effect, so kick and snare has one additional rule, is that they are the main ones that sidechain. So when we look at the whole signal chain here, so we have aggregate mix out, aggregate wet, aggregate drums, sidechain, no sidechain, and no sidechain and sidechain. So sidechain is basically everything that comes in through all the other points. So let's back up a bit. So in the Cyberpunk template, because we're making Cyberpunk, for example, everything here, so we've got ARPs. So if we rewind a bit and just play the ARPs. So this is a group for all the ARPs in the system. Leads is a bit weird because generally you would have more leads, but sometimes you only have bass. Let's just go to bass. Again, same principle applies. We have a single aggregation point. So if we unmute that and we just only play one, which I should have selected the right one. So those are basically everything in here gets aggregated to one point, which then again lets me see what the sound is doing. Now each instrument has its own effect chain, partly because a lot of the instrument's character can be derived from the specific effects that you have on it afterwards. So if we were to turn the effects on this one off and just play it. I mean, I can't quite fully turn it off because like there's still effects somewhere else. So if we turn this back on, so that's the main thing. It's like if you want to adjust the character of one single instrument, it's worth having a single effects chain for that instrument and then alter it for that one single instrument. But if you're applying aggregate effects through an entire group, you have to think about you're thinking a different frequency map, a different range. So for example, in this one, I'm just cutting lows, again, changing phases and adding disproportionate amount of dynamics, aka distortion, between frequency ranges, right? So that's something that I don't necessarily want to do to every single instrument. I might want to do it for a large section of them, but you know, for the sake of simplicity, I only do it on that one. I thought I did it on more, but apparently I only do it on that one. So you want to have equalizing and, you know, like macro, not micro, but macro adjustments for a group. So in the past, some things I would also do is, for example, in the equalizer, is I would do something similar to this, where I would cut off frequencies at a particular point and, you know, restrict the frequency band of where the space would sit, so that way the treble would sit at a higher range. So this is kind of like, you can think about it as a broad range of, not necessarily effects, but a broad range of mixing and wave shaping techniques that you want to apply to the group as a whole. Whereas instrument effects are just basically, I want to make this sound, make this thing sound nasty and distorted, and that's basically what this is about, right? That's why you don't apply it to all. So the signal goes from all these, go up to here, which means that if I wanted to, I can control the volume of this group. And in some other songs I do, where I adjust the volume of the bass for maybe the entire aggregate so that it sits better in the mix. And then, so that once the bass is there, I send it off to here, just in case, because I used to do this as well, like where I would cut off frequencies down the bottom. So I mean, this is an older legacy leftover of where I had split worked. So the ambience parts, like the effects and all that, the ops, the bass, and the leads will all mix in here, and then they would mix and go to the, depending on the situation, it would go aggregate wet or aggregate mix out, or sidechain and no sidechain. So for the most part, they would all go sidechain except the bass. And then they would go up, the aggregate drums would get mixed in here. They would the kick and snare would aggregate the sidechain part, and then they will all end up here on aggregate mix out, which is the last step before going into stereo out. This is the reverb. I thought I fixed that. It's supposed to be something else. But yeah, in general, this is how you make a starting off template, is that you don't have to necessarily think too much of, once you've done all the signal work and everything else about this, it then becomes a problem of adding an instrument and making it fit within your within your template. You don't have to have leads, arps, and bass and drum groups. You can have as many or as little as you like. But the idea here is that, you know, you've got a predefined signal chain, and when you right click and say, hey, I want to add a new instrument, right, all you do is just map it to the correct output that you want to head out to, and the rest of the template does its work. You don't have to then wire it anywhere else. It also means that in this example, I have a few ones that are on, a few instruments that are on, some of them are off. At least in Cubase, anyway, I can load up a template and have the sounds that I want to use generally for a track already loaded, wired up, and set up to go. I don't have to then go think about, hey, I want to use I want to use this group of sounds. Like, it doesn't stop me from doing that. I can still go ahead, add another synth, and look up new sounds, or look up new, or look up for a different sound, or come up with a new one. But what it does mean is that when I load this up, I've got most of the sounds that I want to work with already. So, and if that's the case, it just makes it easy to go and get into the sound, into the track, rather than spending time looking for individual sounds to then wire it all up. So, from a signal processing chain point of view, you've done the bulk of the signal processing chain. You've saved time on that, and every time you decide to make a new project. And in terms of like, oh, I need to look for what sounds am I looking for? You've got a selection of sounds that you can then work with. You don't have to think about it too much, other than I can experiment with what I have here. It's in Cubase's case, you can enable it or disable it. That makes it faster or slower to load. In Live, you've kind of got a similar thing, although it's a bit more tedious. And I would argue that in templates for Cubase, for Ableton, are a little bit more tricky, because you can't just disable a track and not have it take time. Now, in terms of Live, almost everything is still the same, except you have to understand that the way the signal works in Ableton is that, whereas in Cubase you bounce it off, you can tell where to go to some sort of mixing console here, that you've got a mix console view. In Live, it always goes to the higher group. So unless you're sending it off to the next level, unless you're sending it to a send effect, like the majority of the by default, it will go up to the group above. So yeah, I mean, you can send it to other ones, but it's far more limited in terms of where you can send it to. And so your aggregation points are, whereas in whereas in Cubase you would have at an audio mix group. Yeah, I mean, this is kind of the same thing, except that this is a little bit more implied. Like Ableton kind of gives it to you for free, whereas in Cubase you have to program it, but then you get a lot more. Anyway, same thing applies, right? And then this sends it up to here, and then you can send it off to where you wanna, to one of the peers or to one of the outputs. Generally, it ends up going to main, or unless you do send effects kind of thing. But that's Live, almost the same. Same thing again in terms of templating. Same thing, insert a audio track or a MIDI track, route it, and have your things ready. So I mean, just to give you an idea, like how, like, I've got an orchestra VST with pianos, brass. Like, I've got a lot of things here that I can use in terms of like VSTs in terms of like an orchestra kind of thing, and they're not enabled. It doesn't take up memory, doesn't take CPU, but I have it there. So if I want to do an orchestral piece, I don't have to look for my orchestral template. I can just go here and enable the stuff that I want. Or if I want to have an orchestral section, again, I don't have to create a whole new project because it slows down so much, or I might mess up the signal frequency, the signal chain. This is already done. I've already done the work, and I can just take advantage of it. I only need to do it once. So yeah, that's the idea behind a template. It's not necessarily just a quick way of doing things. It's more about like this is the accumulated knowledge of all the things that all the over time, everything that I've the accumulated knowledge over time of the things that I've done and other things that I've used, and where am I likely to use again, and I just put them here because like I'm likely to go ahead and I'm gonna use them I'm likely to use them anyway, so I might as well have it there. So when I don't have to then spend time going, oh, I really want that legend patch, I forgot what it is, and spend time looking for it. I know it's there. Saves time. I can just go straight into music production rather than spending time wasting it on searching my sound set. Or, if I want to do sound design, it then becomes focused sound design, and I don't end up with copies of the same sound all over the place because I couldn't find it or I couldn't remember it. Now you don't have to categorize. Like I've got things categorized in a way. So I've got like the synthesizer name and the patch that is loaded, and then I've got them set into groups. So like I've got a polyphonic group and a monophonic group. The reason for that is that at least for me, I know which patch supports polyphony and which one doesn't. So I can just know that I want, hey, this patch only does one voice at a time, therefore it belongs in the mono group, and if it belongs in and if it sits there in the mono group, then I know that if I wanted to play two notes at the same time, I have to go look for one in the polyphonic set. And again, I can just add it, or if you want to, you can replace an existing one that you're using. So, but yes, so that's the parts of the template thing. The other thing that I tend to do is that on both Ableton and things like this, you can save the project as a template. You can say, hey, save as template, and then when you go new project, scoring, you've got templates there already that are blank. Not necessarily, it doesn't have to be blank, but in theory, you've saved them up. It's separate from a song, and you can just go, hey, I want to use this song as a template. You save it as a template, and then when you go File New, you can select the template and say, hey, I want to use this one, and start from there. One habit that I did get into is that normally I tend to save the song, and then if I want to make a new song, I will go save as a new song, and then delete the entire thing. It's the same thing in effect. But like, as long as it gets you, there is the same thing where if you've got an accumulated set of knowledge. But yeah, so that's the idea of a template. Now the challenge ideally should be about you building a template that works for you. Now it doesn't necessarily have to be cyberpunkish. If you're into synthwave, make a synthwave template. But the idea here is like, think about the sound sets that you want to use, and how you would group them together in a way that it works for you, so that when you are starting at a blank, you don't start with a blank project. You start with a default set of assumptions that get you going. All right. Now, in terms of cyberpunk sounds, now there's two different thoughts about this. The first one is like you can start off with using wavetables and crazy FM and doing all sorts of modulations. This is not one that I've made. Patches that I tend to make are in phase plant. So unfortunately, I tend to fall under the category of I'll make a so of my split brain kind of situation where I will use complicated sound form generation. So for example, here I've got a wavetable, a square wave, and an analog. It's one sitting at the note, one 12, one semitone below, and the other one 2 semitone below. So that way you've got a bass, kind of like building foundation, and then the crazy stuff happens in the distortion area. That's a simple one. Okay, so this is a more simple one. So to make cyberpunk in a way, you can pick really simple oscillators. The main trick is actually your effects. Okay? How you distort and abuse the sound at that point. So for example, if I were to switch all of these effects off, if I switch them all off, we'll turn off this one too. Right? That's the sound. If I turn and then if I turn on multipass, so each one probably so let's do this. So that's with this effect chain running, with no effects chain. So that's no effects chain. And so if we turn on multipass, you can see what it does. We've just introduced a whole bunch of distortion and extra harmonics. Now, if we turn that off and we turn one of these on, now the way that I've got this set up is that I've actually got like multiple oscillators, multiple sound sources, and they're all going into different lanes here in faceplan. Again, doesn't matter what the synth is. I'm just trying to show you the sound principle. So you can see how that's distorted that one. How I added more of the upper end. I don't think. You can see the LFOs and things like that happening there. And then if we turn them all on, you get this sound. And then if you turn this on, you get like a lot of cyberpunk's sound is from the effects chain, or at least in this kind of industrial kind of genre. A lot of it is just not necessarily the. So if we turn that off, and we check that we've got no other effects running. And like, it's just pretty straightforward soul wave with two sets of PWMing square waves underneath it at different phases, right? And it's only when you add the effects that you end up with the sound that you want. So So let's go back to this one because this one's ridiculous. So this one has a lot of effects in it to distort and change the sound a lot. And the main point of this is that you want to control the harmonics that you get, and that's primarily what this is about. What you're going to be doing. So like you're going to be generating a basic sound wave. Let's see if we can start it. Maybe we can. All right. So let's just add a basic. Yeah, let's go. Right. Simple sawtooth. Rather simple envelope. Let's just make it a little bit plucky. Now the reason why we're getting reverb is because we've got reverb somewhere down the chain, so I don't remember where it is, so let's not worry about it for the moment. Okay, so we've got this, we've got a thing here. Let's add a sine wave at 12 semitones. And add it before the envelope filter, and let's just say, hey, let's just add a filter. Let's say 1,000 hertz. I don't know. It's just, we're just messing around. But if you don't like that filter, you can just get rid of it. And let's just add a ladder filter. Woohoo! And that would change the characteristics of how the filter behaves. Let's just drive it and add some resonance. And drive it even more. And at least faceplant tells you how the filter is distorting as you increase the amount of drive into the filter. So if you want to raise the resonance, I don't know, 50%. Let's just say now, because this is lane 2, lane 1's going to go to lane 2, or maybe we don't. Let's just say that, hey, let's just bit crush it. No, let's not bit crush. Let's just add. Do we want a bit crush? Yeah, let's have a look. Let's have a look, shall we? Lo-fi. Maybe we wanna. All right. And then maybe we want to put a formant filter on it. Now, if we want to do something funny, we can add 2 LFOs at. Let's just add that and we modulate one there. plus minus, wink. I mean, we can also add like and now we've got this form and fill. I mean, all I'm trying to show here is like you can come up with all sorts of crazy industrial sounds just with the basic shapes, and really what you're experimenting with in getting the sound that you want is your FX chain, really. And from that point, it just becomes a question of like how do you want to cut your sound? How do you want to distort? First you distort it, then you manipulate the distortion that you've just generated, from the harmonics, because you cut off, and then you go, yeah, I'm just going to distort it even more. And what effects do you want to put into it? So, like, for example, I think there's Faturator, and like it adds fuzz to it. I mean, if we were to put this track, let's just copy that and move it here and just play. You can you can do key tracking as well, but my point here is that experiment with sound. In terms of kick and snare, again, it's very similar to, like, think of it as a really aggressive version of synthwave, right? Except without the French the Frenchiness to it. It certainly has to be more machine, so you're always hitting on the beat, more so than humanized, and it can be a little bit more repetitive, a lot more noise. Sometimes adding one thing I missed out on adding is that saying sometimes noise is required for your effects, but again, it's up to you to determine what that sound is in terms of sound design. But yeah, like mostly the bass in this kind of thing is really where it sits at. You're looking at monophonic synthesizers, one voice, so technically speaking that polyphony should be one. And other things you can think of is your scale selection, right? Scale selection. So in this track, what the heck did I use? So I used G Phrygian. So things like natural harmonic minors, Phrygian, more the dark end of the selection. So Locrian and even super Locrian become viable scales that you can manipulate. The other thing is also like you want to use if you're on a scale. Sometimes a trick that I like to do is like I may not necessarily hit the note that's in the scale. So let's say you're going is like in this example, I'm going for D, and instead of D, I turn this off and I go for C sharp. That's out of the scale. So it's like. That's this to it, and because it's out of the scale, like it sometimes messes up with people's head, and it makes it even more dissonant. So think about when to tactfully use that. Like you might want to use that once and so very often. Drums, it's really up to you. I tend to use I tend to use don't do that. So I can't remember where that came from. Damn, I thought it would tell me. Oh, there it is. So I just use the Synthwave Dojo's BDB snare. Yeah, that's not. Yeah, so heavy snares. You don't have to use. Anything truly out of whack. I think for the most part, I tend to use a far more complicated beat pattern than really is necessary, at least in some parts, when it's required. Now this track has a bit of swing. So whereas most industrial is or cyberpunk is on the beat, so you would definitely not be adding swing to the track. Yeah, it's not that hard. The key is in the effects chain. Distortion's your friend. Really lo-fi, bassy sounds are great. The darker the progression, the better. One thing I can suggest is because you're using a lot of monophonic synths, don't think in terms of chord progressions. So one thing I do is I tend to think in terms of beats. The bass is playing a beat. So if I play the solo, assuming it's fairly basic. It's just the you can think of the bass as a drum. It's like it's just like hitting those notes like it's making its own beat, and that really drives that point down. And like on other tracks, what I tended to do was yeah, like in other tracks in the past where like things like Dance Cybernetica, like again I follow the same principle as like your bass sets up a beat, not quite a groove, whereas in like in synthwave you would think of it like groove. This is more like like you're beating someone with a keyboard over their heads with it. And so you're kind of sticking to the main note quite a lot. And you don't think in terms of happy chord progressions. Like, you go from, 4-1, 5-1, or you go 4-5-4-5-1. I mean, you can still do that, but the majority of the time, like if you just want to drive that cybernetic feel, like you'll just be hitting on that note. The other thing also is that you want a lot of syncopation. That you don't want to necessarily have your notes while the bass is just like hammering that down. Like your other notes, you want to take advantage of the space where the bass is not playing. So that way, you can create that effect like yeah, I mean, you're creating a kind of like this syncopated space. So one way I'd do it, and it's not the correct way because it can go wrong, is that you take the bass, you go, right, that's where the bass sits, and then you kind of do like this weird rotation on the bass. So you move the bass up and down, forwards or backwards, where you might want to change a couple of things. And that will create this weird interaction between the bass that's actually playing the bass and this new rotated bass that comes in, and you can then alter that one a lot more. A different way to think about this in terms of this structure is that your actual tune, you can think of it as like, because it's one voice, right? It's playing two roles with one voice. So like your tune actually sits up at the upper registers and your bass sits down at the lower register here. And I mean, that's the easiest way. It's like you make your bass, and then in the spaces between the notes, you add in your tune. That's a different way of thinking about on how to make this track. So it's kind of like working around the limitations of a one voice synthesizer, except in this case you can have like 10 of them. And yeah, I mean, that's how I've done it for this track. I've got other tracks. Let's see if they work. Because, like I said, I've changed machines and half the stuff is broken. So I don't know whether it would load correctly or not. The other time it would, like, sometimes it would just outright crash. Yeah, of course it is. Yeah, so I've got hypersaws here, where... And you can see here that in this track, I really violate the rule of staying in key. I don't. I don't know why. Yeah, because the scale is C1 Japanese. I don't think I had enough notes to play around with. I felt like I didn't have enough notes to play around with, so I kind of went off the scale quite a lot. So this is just the bass that I used to do a lot, use a lot. yeah, so that's that kind of like rotated technique where I've taken the bass down here, which is the main bass. I rotated it and then I added the tune on top. So just turn that off. And you can see here that I'm actually using, I think this is Tarkin, which I think I copied her from the synthwave patch, which I think is from, yeah, Gunship. Ah, yes, because I bought their pack. And you can see like how the entire point of the template here is like it provides a set of sounds, and you can just focus on just making the music. But in terms of making cyberpunk tracks, yeah, like the idea here is you start off with a bass that, you know, gives you kind of like, in this one's a little bit more less robotic. And I think it's complemented by the taiko drums, but I can't remember. Yeah, it's not meant to be a walkthrough of this track, but the idea is more extended in that one than it is in this one. This one's a far more simpler track in terms of Mini Machine, and the amount of voices that are available is much lower. But it also means that, you know, like the sound effects in this one are more brutal in terms of like closer to what a cyberpunk track, like an industrial track will sound like. So hopefully that is the challenge. You know, if you want to make a cyberpunk track, you can. If you want to try just build a template, that's fine as well. Just the main goal here is that you know, for people particularly struggling with making music in getting started or just making anything, the first thing is just make a template. Save yourself a lot of time by making sure that you've got the sounds that you are already using commonly throughout your tracks loaded, so that way you minimize the amount of time searching for them. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're restricted to that sound set. It just means that, like in this example here, I don't use all of them. Some of them I should be able to turn off without affecting the sound. And I can just use different sounds, and if I want to make my own, I can make my own. You're not restricted to just what's on there. It just minimizes the amount of work you have to do per track. But yeah, in terms of a challenge, come up with some industrial sounding synth sounds. Think of the most mechanical thing you can think of. Make it kind of repetitive in a way. Oh yeah, the other thing also I forgot to mention, because I haven't activated it. One thing I forgot to mention is that a couple of techniques that come really useful are from Berlin School. People don't know what Berlin School is. It's Tangerine Dream and that sort of thing. A lot of that music there is very, very, very repetitive. But the main thing is that they change timbre a lot. And that's also very present in a lot of industrial tracks to some degree or another. But use the automation to then change the timbre of the sound. I'm not sure, this one. I tend to use a lot of it here to then change how it changes from sounds here to here. Like you can, if I would just play that. So you can kind of tell, like here, because the envelope is sloppier, you hear a lot more of the resonance, whereas in here the envelope is tight. So you can do a lot just by changing the timbre of the sound. But yeah, you can kind of tell that the song, the instrument is changing the characteristics of the sound, and it just adds an extra dimension to the music. Even though you're kind of repeating the same sounds, the fact that the timbre changes underneath the listener's feet, and it also has this kind of pleasant side effect that if you strategize your timbres, you might be able to use one synth in multiple roles. It's not just one synth doing one thing, only doing one particular sound. You can have the same synth change timbres and then have it have multiple roles, kind of thing. But yeah, change of timbres, a lot of automation goes in there. So yeah, that would be the challenge. Make a template, make some sounds, make some new sounds. Try to make it as simple, the oscillator section, as simple as possible. You don't have to use wavetables, but if you feel like using wavetables, use wavetables, but make it as simple as possible. And then explore using your effects chain to then get the sound, that nasty, gritty industrial sound. And then on top of that, then use the automation to then change the timbre of that instrument. So that would be the challenge. All right, cheers.